Fat Moose Comics is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Established in 1982 and under new ownership since 2020, Moose sells a wide selection of comics from every publisher and time period, along with action figures, graphic novels, posters, statues, and more. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you're in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. Filmmakers and movie fans alike should be sure to attend these film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and Round Reel in Bloomfield, New Jersey. Take it from an alum of two of them. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news about events, discounts, tickets, and more. Also, listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts, available via a shared universe network. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss Superman 2, directed by Richard Lester and Richard Donner and starring Christopher Reeve, is the editor-in-chief of 13thdimension.com, returning guest Dan Greenfield. Welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me.
In studio, no less.
In studio, face-to-face. I love it.
At 10 a.m. on a Saturday. Only for you, man. This is not my prime time. Only for you.
Well, yeah, I was actually up very late writing for the site, doing 3 days worth of copies. So if I seem a little fatigued, it's because I am. So
well, I'm glad to have you here. Speaking of the site, what do you have coming up that you want to mention to folks?
Oh, well, we have, let's see, boy, that's a good question. I wasn't even anticipating that. We have, I mean, it might be better off even to talk about some of the recent stuff that we've had, which has been really great. We've been doing a lot with the DC Comics Style Guide, which is going to be out late November, early December, and I was fortunate enough to have a hand in it. So that was a pretty special experience. So we've done a lot of coverage with that. We just ran something on, and we will continue to cover the Neil Adams Artist Edition that will be out in 2025. But the big thing coming up is at the end of November is our annual Toy Hem festival, if you will, where we basically spend the Black Friday to Christmas just throughout the weeks. There are just tons of stories about classic toys and vintage toys, and I had I went to Japan this year, which was a marvelous experience, and got a chance to visit with Yuji Ueda, who is one of the world's great Batman collectors. So we visited him, checked out his collection. So the couple of stories coming up with him. Bill Morrison, who's one of our regulars, who had been doing a column based on kind of like homage covers, his expanding his role at the site, and is going to be doing and has already started doing other types of things. He's got a lot of stuff that he's going to be writing about. So I love this time of year because there's always something to write about anyway. But this is the holiday seasons are always extra at the site. So
awesome. All right. Well, 13thdimension.com. I hope everyone will check it out. So Superman 2, released in 1980 in certain parts of the world, here in the USA in 1981. And of course, this is the story where Superman relinquishes his Kryptonian abilities and his role as Earth's protector to embark upon a romantic relationship with Lois Lane, just as the Kryptonian trio of Zod, Non, and Ursa escape the Phantom Zone and take over Earth. And as I think fans are well aware at this point, there was a lot of behind-the-scenes maneuvering, a shift in directors. Ultimately, we had the release of Richard Donner's cut in 2006. In the past, we have done an episode comparing the two cuts. We've also done an episode squarely focused on the Donner cut. So big picture, our main focus is the theatrical cut. That being said, I did rewatch both cuts back to back the other night, and I have some commentary I will sprinkle in because I don't think you can have a conversation about Superman 2 without that piece of it there in some way, shape, or form. But before we get into all of that, as always, I think the biggest, most important piece of this, the personal side. What has your relationship and experience with Superman 2 been over the years? What space does it occupy in your Superman fandom? And yes, we know Batman is number one in your heart, but I've gotten you to talk about a lot of Superman over the years, which I'm very proud of.
I'm wearing a Superman shirt for those who, you can't see it, but I'm wearing one.
Yeah. So just your history, your experience with this film.
Oh man, this is essential. This is a seminal work in my life, and it has a very actually personal appeal to me, because in 1981, when I was graduating middle school, my mother asked me, she's like, what do you want for graduation? And I was like, all I want is to go see Superman 2 on the night it premieres and go out to dinner. And that's it. She's like, that's it? I'm like, believe me, that's a big deal. That's what I want. And that's what we did. So we had the graduation ceremony, went to dinner, and then we went to see the movie at the Amboy Cinemas in New Jersey. It no longer exists. But anybody who's from that part of New Jersey, central New Jersey, which does exist, by the way, for all of those who are debating, are familiar with the Amboy Cinemas. And, I got the program, and, I remember it just was electrifying to get to see it, because the first movie it was sort of kind of snuck up on me, because I wasn't a Superman fan. But it wasn't like I disliked Superman fan, at all. But he just didn't really appeal to me that much. Then when I saw the first movie and fell in love with it, fell in love with Superman as a character, and fell in love with the whole concept. And then it was on cable, and I watched it incessantly. And I still think it probably is the movie that I've seen more than any other in my entire life. And then, so when Superman 2 came out, this was like, I could not wait. And I ended up seeing it in the theaters a number of times, because, it wasn't like there was any streaming or anything like that. And that summer, I was just completely obsessed. I had a crush on Margot Kidder. I was completely obsessed with the movie. And you've heard this story before, because what I used to do was on Saturdays at that age, when I used to get my comic books, there was a flea market, pretty decent distance away, but I wasn't driving or anything, so I'd have to ride my bike. And ride my bike it was a perilous journey, but I was going to do it. And in my head was always playing the Superman theme, because it was like in my head I was flying to this flea market. And it was just really, really a big part of my development as a fan, really a big part of growing up. Also that feeling of freedom that movie gave me. So it's a big deal in my universe.
I understand. I said this last week when we were talking about Superman the movie. It applies here as well, where I watched all 4 of these Christopher Reeve films as a kid, either on HBO or cable or VHS, wherever we got it. So I watched them as a kid, and they definitely made an impression, but they just never imprinted upon me as strongly as they did for certain others.
Oh yeah.
Like yourself. And,
oh yeah.
And that memory that you're describing, I don't have the equivalent of that with these movies. I have it with other things within my Superman fandom, but not that specifically. But at the same time, I have revisited these movies a number of times over the years, and they do certainly occupy a sizable place in my fandom. It's interesting because even prior to the Donner cut, and even putting that aside, I think I did always hold up Superman 2 as my favorite of the series for reasons that we'll discuss. Now, having very recently just gone back and watched Superman the movie so closely, and then watched both cuts of this so closely, I do hold up Superman the movie as the best and my favorite of the series. Mm-hmm. I see it as the pure vision of a director, fully realized. It's able to navigate 4 different settings and tones while still retaining that singular voice. And it's a vision of the character that, while it doesn't line up with what I have in my head and my heart in every single way, it is still a vision that resonates with me. And I feel like it just holds up start to finish in a way that none of the other films, certainly 3 and 4, do, but even Superman 2. But that being said, there's still a lot that I love about this movie.
Oh, it doesn't hold up nearly as well as I would like it to. Really, I think that things already started to fall apart with the second movie. And that's not to say that I don't still have, that I don't still love it. It's not to say that it doesn't have a sentimental part of me. But you could see the seams in the second one. And in the first one, it is an epic. And Superman 2 is not as big a movie. And that was by design by Richard Lester. When he came in as director, he didn't actually like the Donner approach of that. He liked the more shticky kind of campy So I think part of watching the movie now, being aware of all the craziness and bitterness behind the scenes, you can't help but see the seams. You can't help but notice when Lois Lane completely looks different. When the tonality, the shifts in the movie, even the effects aren't as strong as they are in the first movie. The first movie, it's not perfect, it's dated, but it's still, the flying sequences really hold up. Here, you can see where it feels awkward. If there are parts of it that feel forced, and some of the humor definitely feels forced, but it's still a cracking good story. And what's remarkable to me is that when you do look at, despite all of that, it does still hold together as a story. They had enough big time talent working on this at various aspects of it that they were able to stitch together a cohesive plot that made sense. The movie holds up for me as a really, really good movie, but I don't know if I could call it a great movie anymore.
I understand. And as far as how it stitches together, I think what it has in its favor when you look at the two cuts is that both movies do follow the same roadmap.
Yes.
The vast majority of the plot points are the same. It's largely how certain things play out. We'll talk about it. And of course, those tonal shifts. But overall, they are still following that same roadmap. But yes, the seams are there. I will say that for me, what stands out the most about Superman 2 is the humanity and the fallibility of our main character that you see in this film. In either cut, but especially when you put both cuts together. Because I think what the theatrical cut does more effectively, in fairness, is really show that longing from Clark/Superman's side for Lois. There are more scenes with the two of them that I think help sell what he wants better. Yes. However, I do think the Donner cut does a vastly superior job of showing that internal conflict in terms of actually making the decision to give up his powers. Right. And then really takes us all the way there in terms of the regret and the quest to get them back and the sacrifice that's entailed in terms of giving up this relationship with the spirit of his father. But when you look at, again, either one, but especially the two of them together, I really do like that personal journey that we go on with the character. And then Zod, Non, and Ursa, ton of fun. Yeah. That battle in Metropolis is really kind of amazing, especially in 1980 standards. It's really, really something. So there's a lot about this movie that we certainly love. I was going to save this for the end, but we might as well talk about it now. I know any Superman fan listening to this, I know it's on their mind. It's on the tip of their tongue. Which cut do you prefer? So it seems like you land firmly in the camp of the theatrical.
Well, that's just because of how I'm wired and the sentimentality of it. No, when I watch the Donner cut and I think about what could have been, I'm like, oh man, this could have been better. This could have been an even more interesting version of the story. You watch the Donner cut and it has basically the same ending as the first movie, but that's because that was originally the plan for the end of the second movie anyway. So I don't, in that regard, you still don't know how it all would have tied together. Conceptually, but you don't really get to see it. But if I'm going to turn it on, I'm going to turn on Superman 2 because that's the one, that's the muscle memory. That's the one where it's like listening to a favorite album. Are you listening to the one with the remastered version? Or are you going to listen to the one with the bonus cuts, bonus tracks? Or are you just going to listen to the one? And it kind of depends on your mood. But for me, it's like if I'm going to listen to Exile on Main Street, I'm going to listen to Exile on Main Street. If I'm going to listen to Let It Bleed, I'm going to listen to Let It Bleed. And so where Superman 2 comes in, it's the same thing. If I'm likely to do it, I haven't watched the Donner cut in a long time, and it's not out of anything other than I look at that more as an artifact than I do a film. I look at that more as a study in what might have been and how filmmaking works, as opposed to being an absorbing story. And with Superman 2, because of my history with it and its history, I'm able to look at it just I'm able to look at it for what it is, as opposed to what the Donner cut is.
No, I hear you. And in terms of this behind the scenes maneuvering that we've been talking about here. Like I said, I think people are generally familiar with this, but for anyone who's not or needs a really, really quick refresher, yes, originally Donner was shooting Superman 1 and Superman 2 together. It was a difficult production. There was a lot of friction between Donner and the Salkinds. Eventually, they brought in another director, Richard Lester, to act as a go-between.
Right.
And eventually, the decision was made to put the rest of the Superman 2 filming on hold and just finish Superman the movie. And they did that, and it came out, and it was a great success. And Donner was on deck to come back and finish shooting Superman 2. And then he got this telegram that his services would no longer be required. Richard Lester took over, replaced him as director, filmed the rest of the movie, and also went back and reshot a good number of other scenes as well, at least partially, so that he could be credited as the director
because of Directors
DGA
Guild
rules. Yeah. And to answer the question that I posed to you, and this is difficult, and I think I've gone back and forth on this over the years about the cuts here. So I think that the theatrical cut, you really can't debate this. It is the more finished, complete product, even though it is this combination of scenes. The Donner cut utilizes a scene that was put together from a couple of different screen tests.
Yep.
Like you said, it uses the ending that Donner originally had in mind, where Superman changes time. It plays as insane when you watch the Donner cut because we know they repurposed that ending for Superman the movie. The thing that I've always said, what breaks my heart about this is that I can't begrudge Donner. He had the opportunity to put together what he wanted to, and he wanted to show what the original intent was. Yeah. I can appreciate that. What I've always said, and people have heard me say this before, but what's always bothered me is that had he returned to finish Superman 2 after Superman the movie came out, obviously he would have needed a different ending.
Yeah.
So I just wish that had been taken into account. And I've always said, if you just stop the Donner cut after he flies away from Lois on the balcony, it's a beautiful, bittersweet ending. And we could have gone right from that to him in space, and that could have been the end of the movie. So that ending, the screen test, those are a couple of huge knocks against it. Tonally, though, I do prefer the Donner cut. He wasn't able to film a lot of those action scenes, but he and his editor, of course, were able to cut out and cut around a lot of the campier aspects. And so it gave it a more serious, grounded feel. And I think especially in that Metropolis battle, taking out that camp, the guy who's still carrying on his phone call as he's being blown away by the super, you take that out, it gives it a more epic feel, which I like. And far and away, hands down for me, the biggest strength of the Donner cut are those Marlon Brando as Jor-El scenes. I feel like thematically and narratively, it ties together both films in a really powerful, beautiful way. At the same time, though, one thing, and this is not about, they use a screen test or the ending, but one of the things I really noticed rewatching the Donner cut is that there's so little Superman in the first huge swath of the movie, other than him saving the kid at Niagara Falls. There's very little Superman until we get to that Battle of Metropolis. Obviously, you see him in costume at the fortress with Lois and all of that, but there's very little Superman action, and there aren't a ton of scenes between Lois and Clark. And so I don't think that the energy and flow of the Donner cut match the theatrical cut. So that's one other kind of big knock against it for me.
Well, but see, going back to, and again, don't want to go too deep in the weeds here. But the thing about the Donner cut, I mean, even Donner himself said, this is not the movie I was going to make. He says, I basically, this is the material I have. And so what I've done here is basically take what I have and what was available and try to make what might have been. But this was not the intent of what the movie would have. It's not like you could say this is what the Superman 2 would have been like. It wouldn't have been, because originally Superman 1 was going to end on a cliffhanger. And so there's a whole other movie out there in the ether that never got made. And so this was more, again, that's why I look at it more as a filmmaking exercise and a historical artifact than I do as a film, because it doesn't hold together it's got all of these great elements and all of these things where you're like, and like you said, there's certainly improved elements of it. But it is something that I look at more from a more detached viewpoint than I look at the actual theatrical cut.
I understand. Overall, I think that is the appropriate way to look at the Donner cut, as that exercise, as that artifact.
Yeah.
The fact that it even came out and we got to see it is
great.
astounding. And
It's
I'm so
fantastic.
glad.
Oh, yeah.
To finally answer my question, I think ultimately, gun to my head, I have to pick the quote unquote better or more complete cut. I think I do have to go with the theatrical. However, where I truly land in my heart, and I think a lot of fans feel this way as well, that the best version of Superman 2 is a combination of the two. And what I will say is that were I to, and I know there are fan edits of this out there, or I'm sure there are, if I were to put together my definitive cut of Superman 2, for whatever this is worth to people, my baseline, my starting point, my foundation is the Donner cut. And then I would insert certain scenes from the theatrical
Well, that
cut.
makes sense.
So take that for what
sure.
it is. Yeah. So moving more specifically into Superman 2 and this theatrical cut, and we don't have to go scene by scene or anything like that. We can jump around. But I do want to start with the opening. We do get this montage during the credits. Right. We see scenes from the previous film. But then we open with this whole terrorist plot in Paris with the hydrogen bomb, and Lois is there investigating the story, and Superman performs this rescue. I do think this was an effective, dynamic way to open the movie. Even more so when you compare it to the other cut where you don't have that. It really, I think, sets the stage, and it gives us that much needed key Superman action from the jump. I do think it's important.
It's a great way to open a movie, because the if there was a criticism of the first movie, is that it takes you 45 minutes or so, or almost an hour to get into for Superman to even show up. Some people see that as weakness. Some people see that as a strength. But I think it was very important to immediately establish right into the action. You don't need to. They retold the story in the credits, and actually in a fairly, I think, effective way. I mean, I think as far as opening credit recaps go, it's one of the best. It's not as good as Spider-Man 2 with all the Alex Ross paintings, which I thought was probably the best that's ever been done, most effective, but it's a really well done opening, and then you get right to this. Clark's in Metropolis. Everything is shorthand at this point. We don't need any further explanation. There's no, nothing needs to be explained. We all know, and besides, remember, everybody knows the whole Superman, Clark, Perry White, all that dynamic anyway. So let's throw Superman into a really big, Superman type thing. I mean, it's not like he's got to fly across the Atlantic. He's got to rescue Lois. He's got to save the Eiffel Tower in the city of Paris. It has all of the right pieces. And then, of course, the payoff at the end being that this is actually the MacGuffin, because this is what really kicks off. It's almost like a James Bond cold open, where it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the plot, but what it does do is that it sets up the rest of it, and because not all the Bond cold opens are like that, but a lot of them are, where this sets up really what happens in the rest of the movie, and of course the payoff is that it just happens to break open the Phantom Zone when the bomb goes into outer space.
Absolutely. Do we buy that Clark really was oblivious to this situation that's going on? That he's just sitting in his apartment reading Dickens?
I think that look. That I think is just a great bit of humor. I think that the Superman we think of would already have known somehow. He certainly would have heard it on the radio. He certainly would have. But I just like it's just a character bit about the Clark Superman side of things. No, of course not. You'd think that he probably was flying around all weekend. Saving cats from trees and what have you. But if Clark Kent were to spend a weekend, it probably would be reading Dickens and just taking some time off. So it's not entirely implausible, but it is. I've always thought that it was kind of a funny line.
It is. We can go along with it. The other thing I wonder too is that's just what he tells Perry. Right. But we know a big part of this movie is that he doesn't know. He is unaware of Zod, Non, and Ursa because he's at the fortress with Lois. So maybe he was at the fortress.
He could have been.
It could have been something like that. We can go with it. I love the shirt rip that we get as he's running.
This is the great one
in the alley. That's great.
Yeah.
Maybe when we're done with this series, looking at each of the movies, we'll rank the shirt rips. But this one is up there. The one that's coming up next week in Superman 3. After that dumpster fight,
classic. Yeah.
So, but this is a standout. I love too how he hurls the bomb into space. That's his go-to. We saw it with the missile in the first movie. We see it here, and of course, like you said, we need it to get the criminals free from their Phantom Zone prison. But I just love that that's his go-to. But at the same time, what the hell else is he supposed to do with these bombs?
Right. It makes sense. I mean, if where else? What else is he going to do? There's But I will say that there are a couple of hiccups there. One, we in that opening sequence, just to quickly backtrack, when you hear the voice, "You three villains of Krypton," that sounds. I mean, they couldn't have hired Rich Little to do Marlon Brando. I mean, they could have. They at least should have hired a sound-alike to do, because it's jarring to me. That is one of the things that is weird. Now again, he was a kid. I didn't really care so much, but it's not only truncated but that voice, it's like, it sounds so strange to me because it's so clearly not Marlon Brando. But also, this is the first part of the movie when the Phantom Zone explodes, or when the portal explodes, is they go to animation for it as opposed to practical effects or what. And I thought that's a really weird choice of a movie with this kind of budget and a movie that has this kind of. I mean, the whole point of this movie was that you will believe a man can fly. But even then, I always thought it was weird that they used animation to show it catching fire, and then the explosion is a practical effect. Did that ever miss the mark for you, or is that something that I just have been overthinking for the last 40 some odd years?
Yeah, it's just you. No, no, I'm sure there are fans who are nodding along as you're saying that. It never bumped me. I don't know why. It just never really.
It's like, it makes me cock my head. I'm like, that's with all of the resources they had, there were other ways to do that. So it might have been that just at that point they were cutting corners. But it is a weird. To me, it sticks out.
Well, the next time I watch it, I'm sure that scene will be ruined for me.
Sorry. Sorry for everyone else, too.
I have to say, and like I said, I don't mean to keep comparing the two, but I think this opening and this freeing of them works for this version. There's something about the missile that he diverts from the first film being what releases them that I really do like in terms of how it ties them together. Sure. But like I've been saying, you really need this dynamic opening action sequence. Yeah. So I'm willing to sacrifice that tie between the two movies. And then for better or worse, this allows this movie to stand on its own more. Mm-hmm. I think there's so many, you talk about the different official releases, but then there are all these different fan versions. And for those who have combined Superman 1 and Superman 2, then I think then it really works pretty seamlessly. Right. But for this, I think this was effective. Now, I suspect where we'll end up spending the bulk of the time for the rest of the episode probably will be on the Lois and Clark and the giving up of the powers and all of that. But while we're here in this moment of the Kryptonian criminals being freed, your take on Zod, Non, and Ursa. Obviously, Zod was originated in the comics. There was a female prisoner, Feora, here replaced with Ursa, and they also introduced this character of Non. Both Ursa and Non have subsequently made their comic book appearances. There was also a fourth criminal in early drafts of the script, a prankster character who they discarded, and thankfully so. Especially when you look at the theatrical cut and knowing Lester's campier leanings,
his predilections, it would have been really bad.
Yeah, so I think that was great. But I'm just curious. I guess I don't even know how to phrase this question, but I guess the thing I keep coming back to with these three is that their characterizations and their motivations are so basic. Mm-hmm. It's revenge, it's power. Mm-hmm. That's really it. Yet, undeniably, it works. So what is it about this that is so effective? There's a lack of nuance or depth, but it still plays.
It's primal.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is that first off, it works very well as a counterpoint to Superman, who is anything but. You have Superman. First off, this is a version of Superman that also gives lie to that whole notion that Superman is a boring character. I mean, we're not even going to get into that whole nonsense. But this is a really good example. Both movies are, that are really good example of why he's not a boring character and why he's, that internal struggle, while at the same time having ideals that he needs to uphold, and also that it is not always easy to do that without being navel gazing, without it being a whiny, emo. I love doing this, but it's not the easiest thing in the world to do. It isn't easy being me. And you sympathize with him because he doesn't whine about it. It's just one of these things. With them, it's just is what it is. And it's kind of refreshing. I think we've also gotten to the point in comics, in comic book related media, is because the villains have become so popular, and the villains have pretty much become franchises unto themselves. The Joker is his own franchise now. Poison Ivy has an ongoing comic that's almost up to issue number 30, which only in the when I look back decades kind of still blows my mind. But and while I think that that's interesting, at the same time there is this tendency to make all villains. It's like what they did with Loki. They all eventually become anti-heroes as opposed to straight up villains. And what I like about Zod and the other two is that they are bad people. They are fascists. They are out for world domination. They are cruel. They are monstrous, and that never changes. And in that sense, but it never devolves into mustache twirling. They never, even under Lester's hand, they never become silly. Terrence Stamp is Zod. He's terrifying. He's absolutely terrifying. He is so dangerous just by walking around. And even though he occasionally will roll his eyes or whatever, and there's that stuff, but it's all within character. And it just, I think it really works because he's not Lex. Lex has a little bit of, Lex is funny. He's cruel, and he is villainous, and he is mean, and he is, but he also has, he's having a good time. He's enjoying himself. He likes being a bad guy. He likes, he's more of a sociopath than he knows what's right and wrong, but he just doesn't care, and so there's a roguish quality to him. But with these guys, they're just horrible. And I think that really does work as a counterpoint. They're so fueled by hate and anger, and they're so primal that they are effective. And because they are also really, particularly Terrence Stamp, who is incredibly charismatic. I mean, if you've ever seen him in any other movie, he steals every scene that he is in. So the one thing that is worth noting is that he made General Zod a household name, because prior to this, nobody knew who General Zod was. General Zod wasn't even like the main evil Kryptonian in the comics. It was, I think, Jax-Ur was like the main one, and General Zod was part of his posse. General Zod is a better name. And but when now it's, this is one of those cases where his performance in these movies made General Zod an A-list villain in a way that he had not been.
Absolutely made Zod iconic. Neil before Zod has been a part of not every subsequent iteration, but most.
I have a Zod cat and a Zod tattoo. I mean, on my right shoulder, I've got the Smallville Kryptonian glyph for Zod, just because I love the design.
Whoa!
And we had two cats. Lex, unfortunately, died not too long ago, but they were brothers, and they were Lex and Zod. Lex was the sleek one. Zod was the hairy one, so that, one was bald, one was not, he wasn't bald, but he was just short hair. So Zod made a tremendous impression on me as a character, and it's all down to Terrence Stamp, all of it.
Well, and you mentioned Smallville, and we just wrapped up a huge run of episodes on Smallville, and you know how important that show is to me. But there you have Terrence Stamp as the voice of Jor-El from seasons 2 through 10, and
which I always found strange. It works because it works, but it's like, that's weird.
Well, it was an interesting choice, and there was, we talked about this at length, a lot of antagonism for most of the show between Clark and Jor-El. And very early on, this notion that perhaps Jor-El had sent Clark to Earth to conquer, not to be the savior. And I remember fan speculation at the time between that antagonism and the casting of Terrence Stamp was always like, well, maybe it's not really Jor-El, maybe it's Zod. And when Smallville did Zod, they did Zod a couple of times, but the first time around when Zod possessed Lex's body, and you have that showdown in the field at the end of the season 6 premiere, and we get the classic kneel before Zod, and it's a direct echo of what you see at the climax of this film, where Clark kneels, but then there's always this clever reversal, and in the case of Smallville, there was the crystal that he had that allowed him to pull Zod's phantom from Lex's body. And it's a great moment. My father sends his regards. Like, it was great. But I think everything you hit on here, I think is spot on. I thought you were going to say the deep V, though, of their outfit. I thought you were going to say that was the secret sauce, those deep Vs.
Oh, I love that. Oh, are you kidding me? You know what's weird about that is that Mattel, I think it was Mattel, made like 12-inch versions of the characters. I never realized, because of the way the camera works, is that it's basically burgundy and black, but it comes off as black on camera. And really underneath like the black mesh, it's not black on black, it's black on burgundy for all three of them. But you can't, the camera doesn't pick it up. So when you do see it in merchandise, it's always weird to me that they show that in the actual burgundy that it was meant to be. But I love those uniforms. They're so over the top. They're so of the moment, hairy chested and the thigh high boots and the kind of the Jodhpur look. I mean, it works.
It works. Again, I think you hit on all of it. I think there is something very elemental, very primal. It might be quote unquote simple or basic, but it is effective. And the fact that it ties back to the first film. And like you said, we see a new scene of them being apprehended at the start of the movie. And then we see what we had previously watched of them being sentenced, but Jor-El is no longer in the picture here.
You were 3 criminals. Yeah.
Even if you hadn't seen footage of them again, nevertheless, it still ties back to the first film. And I think that that juices it a little bit, where you have that tie back. And so that I think just gives it a little bit more. I think the fact that there's 3 of them, the power of 3, there's something about that too. Had it just been Zod freed and running around, it would still have an effect. But the fact that there are 3, and obviously that raises the stakes, just as Lex points out, you are 3, he is 1, Nod grunts, he's like 4 if you count him twice.
But even, and then there's even the line where where Luann, I guess, Lois's colleague or Lois and Clark's colleague, where she talks about Nod, she goes, "Oh my God, the big one's even bigger," and it pisses Lois off. But it's like it just. I mean, it's a line that's played for laughs, but it really does. There's it subtly points again. Not only is it Superman, and this I remember at the time when they talked about this, that it wasn't just Superman going up against someone with his own powers. It was 3 of them, and how in the world was he ever going to beat 3 evil people who can do what he can, including one who is a man monster? And so you are putting the stakes very, very high in terms of what Superman is going to go to. And I think that really is the dramatic core of the movie, like you say, when he does give up his powers and you as the viewer know what's going on in the world. You're like, oh my God, oh my God, how is he ever going to ... And then even if he does, how is he ever going to, he's alone here. There's no Justice League to call upon. This is a world with one Superman. So from a dramatic standpoint, I think it works extremely well, but I also think it's really, in particular, Sarah Douglas, yes, but especially Terrence Stamp, they really sell the villainy and the arrogance and the narcissism of the characters.
I agree. There's something very absolute about the 3 of them.
Yes.
Where Lex, maybe you could negotiate with.
Right.
Whereas
he's a businessman.
Right. You can make him a deal.
Well, that's what I mean. How did he survive as long as he did while working with them? Was that he was constantly making deals. He was a real estate developer.
Exactly. Lex Luthor, ruler of Australia. But yeah, the fact that I think that goes a long way. There's something very absolute where it feels like there is no reasoning with them.
Right.
So yeah, I think it works really effectively. We have the moon sequence, we have the small town, we have the taking of the White House, we have the battle in Metropolis, we have the climax of the fortress, and I'm sure we'll hit on more of this to come, but maybe this is nitpicky, but one thing that has always bothered me when we're in the battle, and it's, again, they do an amazing job with the battle. I don't want to pick it apart, but
sure.
Why does the movie ask us to think that the bus killed Superman? Why would that take him out? It's hard for me to buy that the people in Metropolis would think he's dead. At the same time, it's an indeterminate amount of time that he's been around, so we don't know the extent of the feats they've actually seen him perform, so maybe people aren't sure if the bus took him out. But for the movie to try to create this tension for the audience, I have a hard time with that.
I think the and you're right. You never really buy that. You know he's coming back anyway. I mean, you know that logically because you know that that's not how the movie is going to end. I think the idea is just simply the force of it.
Yeah.
That if Superman, it's the irresistible force in the immovable object. If something thrown with the velocity and power of one of his own should strike him in a certain way, because we don't ever, it's never really established what we see what he's like when doesn't have his powers. We see how he can lose his powers. We see what the effect the kryptonite has on him, but we don't know. And even in the comics, they've pretty much established that Superman cannot die. He's pretty much immortal, and it's when you look at it in the terms of the movie, they never really establish what is his ultimate weakness, what can be done. And remember, the whole point of the battle between the three of them anyway is that they are lethal and would use killing force, whereas he would not. So I never got tripped up on that. Yeah, it seems a little pat, but at the same time, it's how else are they going to? I mean, I suppose there are other ways that they could do it, but if they're going to do a death feint, I mean, the only other thing that they would be able to do, and they were not going to do this in this movie, was have him strangled to death. Or have his neck snapped, which was done decades later.
I gotta tell
reverse.
you something. When we were in that fortress for that climax, and he had Zod in the headlock, I was snap his neck. Done, man.
We wouldn't still be debating it if he had done it back then.
Well, that leads me to my other big picture question that I wanted to ask, and this is something fans have talked about, and it's come up on the podcast plenty of times before as well, but. In that final battle at the fortress, we have Superman's clever ruse. He's able to depower the three of them.
I actually find that one more implausible because we never see his face get weird. I'm watching this and I'm like, I remember at the time when I did watch it, when it happened, I thought, if I may, I just to go back to my original 14-year-old self when I watched it, I didn't pick up on the fact that it was that it was a trick. What I picked up on was the fact that it was different. And I was like, why is the whole room pink and why, or red or whatever it is? And why isn't his face peeling off? And this seems, so the clues were there. And now knowing the payoff after the first viewing of it, I've never been able to get past the fact that it is so obvious that he is not, being depowered again. Lois sells it like crazy. I mean, she does a hell of a job selling that scene. Margot Kidder does. But I will say that it's a really neat scene and it's a neat effect. And I like the way it's done, but that stretches the credibility more than him getting knocked by a bus. Yeah, well, that's the thing, because the Lester cut made such a meal out of the effect of the peeling and all of that, whereas in the Donner cut, you don't have that. So it other than the light being on the outside versus the inside, they feel kind of a piece. But with the three of them at the end, you watch either cut of the film, and it seems like they fall to their deaths, each of them. I've been waiting for you to get to this.
Each of them. Superman throws Zod, Non tries to fly and falls, and Lois punches Ursa while they're all depowered and they all fall into the caverns of the fortress, seemingly to their deaths. And what's particularly interesting to me is that even when we got the Donner cut, the scene of the three of them being carted away by the Arctic Patrol How much action do they see up there? This was probably a freaking huge day for them. But even then, that scene was on the deleted scenes of the Donner cut. It didn't make its way in. And I'm kind of baffled by this. And I've been reading about this, and I think it took some time before we saw that scene of the Arctic Patrol, but it was something that Jack O'Halloran had been talking about in interviews, like, no, Donner filmed this scene. But I think for a lot of fans, for years you watch it, and it really seems like Superman killed / allowed them to die and was not bothered by it at all. It's just such an odd choice to me to excise that. How do you feel about this?
Here's the thing. It never occurred to me that they died.
Really?
Ever. And even now, it was a fairly recent viewing that I thought to myself, because I remember others saying that they die. I'm like, no, they don't die. They don't die at the end at all. What are you talking about? And I knew exactly what happens to each of them, and they all fall. I just assumed, because they fall into this this misty area, that they didn't have powers anymore, that they were falling into some sort of, like, as a kid, I just imagined it was like a prison that was below that floor, that they fell into some kind of incarceration. It never even registered with me that they were killed, but that just somehow they were apprehended, and it was whatever, they were basically being knocked into the basement. It never registered as death to me. It registered as incarceration. So I don't know what that says about me. I don't know what the intent was, because I don't think it's ever been spelled out. But I've never been troubled by that, because I'm like, I've been more troubled by the fact that it's like, we don't ever see what happens to them. There's no, like, we know what happens with Lex, but we don't know what happens with the three of them. But it never occurred to me that they were killed.
I feel like that's a big bit of headcanon that they fell into a prison.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say you thought they just fell into the water below. And at first, as the thought was formulating, I'd be like, well, then they would freeze. But we did have established earlier in the movie, despite it being this ice palace, it's warm. Lois wasn't cold.
Yeah, because it's crystal. It's not ice.
Yeah, it's one of these things, and this has come up, and yes, it's come up in the context of talking about other instances where Superman has killed, and this whole debate, because I guess for the wider fandom and the general public, like, unless you knew about this deleted scene or you engaged in the headcanon that you just laid out,
it's funny, you call it headcanon, but it wasn't even like I had to invent it.
Yeah, you felt like that was the implication.
That's just what it felt. Yeah, that's the way I saw it. That was my inference. Because it didn't even strike me that Superman would kill. It didn't even register that he was capable of that. Whereas in The Man of Steel, and again, not to get off topic there, it's so stark and so harsh, and the way it's done is so violently that it just is. I found it appalling, but it never occurred to me. It just never occurred to me. I'm like, no, he knocked them into. It's like playtime in the backyard. You never kill your as a kid, when you were playing in the backyard, cops and robbers, or Batman and Robin, or whatever. You never killed anybody. You just put them in jail. So I just I made that equation.
It's weird because I don't have a specific memory of feeling one way or the other about this when I watched it as a little kid or when I rewatched it, and I really wish I had It's odd to me that I don't even have a memory of how I felt, but I don't know. I don't know if part of me feels like I assume they died. It really looks like to me that they fell to their deaths, and Superman is pretty cavalier about it, but I don't remember being quote unquote bothered by that per se. Right. But then I say to myself, I don't know, or did I just assume, yeah, they are probably fine. Like, of course Superman wouldn't let them die. I can't answer this for myself. Audience, I'd be very curious to hear from you. I imagine there are a lot of fans who probably engaged in a thought process similar to yours, regardless of how specific or not they got about it. But there probably was this sense among people of, they're probably fine. Like, Superman wouldn't let them die.
It's not just that. It's also that they first off, you never see them fall terribly far, and they fall into nice fluffy clouds. So it feels soft to me. I mean, literally, the visuals of it are not like you knocked him off the side of a building or off the side of a cliff.
See, to me, it's so funny because to me, it's the opposite. Now, we know that as big as
it's
the
like falling
fortress,
into cotton,
I guess. But to me, I look at that mist as like, you don't know how far down it is.
Right.
Right. Where to me, it's like, oh my God, they're going down to down.
I just thought he knocked him into the basement. where he keeps his Kryptonian zoo. I don't know. I mean, it's just it wasn't until much later that it made me cock my head. And then when I heard people like definitively saying that I'm like, no, they never show the body.
I still maintain it is still interesting to me though that in both cuts, and especially in the Donner cut, where there's this opportunity, and this was clearly part of the original vision, that there was this conscious choice to not have it in there. Whether
it is interesting.
I guess here's what
I will concede that point.
Part of me says, I wonder, did they want that ambiguity? But I think it's probably not that. I think it's probably they didn't assume there was any ambiguity. They probably assumed people would have your takeaway.
The movie's tone and the character of Superman to that point had been shown in such a way that I did not see him as capable, especially when he wouldn't need to do it. They were all depowered. There was no, it wasn't like the case. Look, if you want to make the argument about Man of Steel and that he did what he did because it was his last choice. And that's, that is part of the core of that debate. At this point, there was no reason. There was no death penalty necessary. They were all depowered. They were humanized. All he needed to do was tie him up and fly him back. The fact that he knocked him out, or they knocked him out and Lois too. I mean, let's not forget that Lois. I don't just see them as a bunch of murderers right there in front of Lex Luthor. It just doesn't wash with me.
I guess though it goes beyond. I think that either of them committed murder, but I think it's more just the cavalier reaction.
Yeah, even that, it doesn't strike me as in their. It doesn't strike me as in their character.
Fair enough. And what I will say, I guess, to fans, I mean, myself included, at various points in time, who kind of looked at this as like, absent that deleted scene, look, it's you can make an argument that it seems like they die, but in fairness to the filmmakers and the performers, and Christopher Reeve in particular, he's playing that scene knowing the script, knowing that there's this other scene. So if it comes off as kind of careless that this happens, he has the wider context of, there's the scene. So.
But that's also part of why I made my inference, because he seems unbothered by it.
Right.
And this Superman would seem to be bothered by doing that. It made, at that point, regardless of everything that had happened to that point, they no longer had power. It was enough for him to crush Zod's hand. That was enough. That was enough payback. And the rest of it was, you go to your room.
Yeah.
That's.
Well, on this note of Superman's judgment, let's talk about this huge choice that he makes in this movie to give up his powers in order to be with Lois. Like I said before, I think the movie, the theatrical cut in particular, does a good job of selling this relationship, or the hope for a relationship, especially from Clark's perspective. We do get a number of scenes before the big moment where you see the two of them in Lois's office when she's making her orange juice, and later on when they're in Niagara Falls in the hotel room, and then walking outside pretending to be this newlywed couple. And one of the things that
with her hat,
but one of the things that I don't know that this fully registered with me, or at least not to the extent that it did with these viewings, which is I appreciate the kindness that Lois shows towards Clark.
Yes,
she
likes him.
She is infatuated with Superman,
right?
But
no, she's in love with Superman.
She cares for Clark as well. And there are numerous times in that office scene with the juice where she's like, "Hey, like, can I give you some constructive criticism? You need to be more aggressive."
Yeah.
And then later on, when they're outside at Niagara Falls, and he's trying to point out the beauty of the scene before them, and she's like, "Well, once you've seen Superman, everything else pales in comparison." And she clocks his reaction, and she's like, "Oh, I'm sorry." Like, I like that. That went a long way for me.
Well, I like this Lois a lot. I mean, I do think of Margot Kidder and the way Lois is written is the gold standard. of all Lois's. And even though she can be a little grating at times, I like her. I like her sassiness. I like her toughness. I like her. I mean, they have tremendous chemistry. When you see the extras, in the Superman the movie, whatever set you have, or what you've seen on YouTube, and you look at the others who were doing screen tests with him as Lois Lane, she is so far and away superior to the other actresses, and they're all good actresses, but there was something that she had and something that they had together that really, really worked. But it was also, they showed her, just like they showed him, is that she's not all one thing, and she is vulnerable. And you do see her, all of that exterior, all of that toughness just melt away whenever Superman is around. But at the same time, she also gives him a hard time. It's like at the end of the first movie, which is, that's the problem with the Man of Steel. They're never around when you need one. I mean, that's a very Lois thing to say. And so here, but it doesn't mean that she demeans Clark. She just doesn't consider him in terms of a romantic aspect. But she's not a mean person. He's a good guy. He's a sweet guy. He's a dork, but she's like, she likes him, in the same way that she likes Jimmy, I mean, who's pretty much absent in this movie, by the way. There's virtually no Jimmy, but she does like Clark. So it is nice to see that. It's just that she doesn't like him in the way that he wants him to, because he wants, that's the funny thing, is that this version of Superman, Clark is who he really is. There's always the argument, which is the mask. Okay. We know that Clark is a disguise, but he wants her to love him as Clark. He knows she would fall. It's a funny thing because he knows as Superman, he's a catch. He knows that she would fall. He knows he's handsome. He knows he's got all of these things, but what he wants her to appreciate about him is the sensitive side. He wants her to love him for his vulnerability. And so it is a constant disappointment that she doesn't see that when he's playing Clark. And so I think that it's interesting to me that is so important to him. But it doesn't mean that she doesn't care about Clark. They're just friends.
Okay. So interesting. So one of the things that we've already been talking about in this little run of episodes is that I said this before, and I'll reiterate this now. I do think that we, and myself included, have exaggerated a bit the extent to which the Christopher Reeve Clark is so bumbling.
Right.
I feel like maybe we build it up a little bit more in our heads, because rewatching these movies and really watching very closely, yes, that's an aspect of it, but I do feel like maybe it's been exaggerated a little bit. I think there's a little bit more integrity to this version of Clark. Yet I do still see this as the disguise.
Yes.
But what's interesting, I've always talked about this, where in my mind, looking at the character, just generally speaking, in my mind, there's Clark the reporter, there's Superman, element of disguise in both, but Clark on the farm, that's the truest sense.
Sure.
In these movies, and this one in particular,
or Clark on the farm or Clark at the fortress.
No, that's what I was going to say. Like that to me, in these films, I really feel like Kal-El at the fortress. That's his truest self. But as far as you got, this is one of the things I was going to ask you, because I agree with you. I think it is important to the Kal-El that Lois is interested in Clark and not just Superman. I don't know how fair that is, though, for him to put on Lois in this context, where even if, as I've been arguing, he's not quite as bumbling as maybe we all think of him as, but there is still quite an act that he's putting on as Clark.
Right.
So I don't know how fair it is when he has those disappointed looks that she doesn't see him that way. I get why he would want her to want Clark, but yeah, I don't know. Whereas in other iterations where you don't have, where Clark's not quite so mild-mannered, I feel like it's more, Lois and Clark is a good example where I understand why that version of the character, it was so important that he knew she loved him,
right,
and not the costume. That was something I was kind of kicking around.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable point. But I always took it as, I want her to love me for more than me being Superman.
Oh, that's a nice way of, you know what? I like that. And maybe that's the way to kind of square this. It's not so much that,
if she's going to love me, I want her to love all of me.
Yeah. Not so much that, she just has to just love Clark, but he wants to make sure it's not just, okay, I like that. I like that. We reference the television series Smallville a lot around here, and there's one Smallville rewatch podcast that's always at the top of my queue. Always Hold On to Smallville, hosted by our pal, Zach Moore. Zach and his guests bring tremendous insight, passion, and humor as they discuss each and every episode of the series that ushered in the renaissance of superhero TV. Listen to Always Hold On to Smallville wherever you get podcasts, and keep an eye out for the other shows under the Always Hold On to banner, including Arrow, DC's Legends of Tomorrow, Superman and Lois, and Star Wars. Aw Yeah Comics celebrates and promotes everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations, Harrison, New York, aka my local comic shop, Skokie, Illinois, or Muncie, Indiana. If you have kids and have been looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow Aw Yeah on social media for more. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Say it with me now. Aw Yeah. This podcast is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP to save 10% on your order. That's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions. It helps support the show too. This business about Lois figuring out the identity. First of all, props to this iteration of Lois Lane, because she gets there, when you look at the franchise as a whole, she gets there relatively quickly.
Yeah. She gets by the end of the first movie, she's there.
Yeah. So I like that a lot. Now, in terms of how she discovers the secret, of course, in the theatrical cut, we have this whole Niagara Falls sequence where she throws herself in, and then Clark refuses to change into Superman.
Great bit.
And this is just a different version of what we get in the Donner cut, where she puts it together in the Daily Planet office and she jumps out of the building, and he, as Clark, just uses his super breath and his, to cushion her fall, and then uses his heat vision to make the awning pop out and all that. I get one of my 2 questions. I guess one of them is, if you were Lois and you were convinced that Clark was, how far would you go? Would you risk your life? It's kind of wild. And then the other question is, what do you make? It's fascinating to the psychology of this. Like, what do you make of the lengths in either cut that Clark goes to in order to save her without becoming Superman?
Well, I'm not. I'm going to stick with the theatrical cut.
Yeah.
But because when I was watching that scene, and I was, first off, so much has been made, especially in recent years on YouTube, of the scene in her apartment in the first movie when she's in the other room, and people say, if you ever needed if anybody ever wanted to understand why the Clark Kent disguise could be effective, watch this scene. And you watch Christopher Reeve, who's cowed, and he's got the higher voice and the hair and the glass, and then he just broadens his shoulders, and right before your eyes, without any special effects, he transforms. It's an amazing thing to see. And there's a version of there are versions of that play out throughout that entire sequence with at Niagara Falls. And what really hits it is when he quickly, she's going through and he's looking around and he doesn't know what, he's not going to go in. He is not going to change to Superman if he can at all help it. And he looks around quickly because he sees a tree, and then he lowers his head and his eyes, and his whole face turns to stone, or to steel, if you will, when he uses the heat vision to burn the tree branch so that she can grab it. And that's it's like, oh, it is Superman. It's not Clark. I mean, he's running around like a moron, and he's like very, very, it's great physical acting by Christopher Reeve to sell it. He really sells it as Clark, bumbling around and doing it, and not in a slapsticky way. It's just the way he moves. And then he stops and he's Superman again. And then he's back to Clark. How far would you go? Well, clearly she thought she was willing to go that far because she really believed it. That's why. And even the button on the end of the scene where she looks at him and she says, "You're who I thought was Superman?" And he goes, "Sorry."
Yeah, she's willing. She's willing to bet her life on it.
She bet her life on it.
Yeah. It's when you talk about that, and that's similar to what we see in the first movie with the mugger in the alley, where he's bumbling, but he's performing these saves at the same time. And I like that. I guess there's an argument to be made about some of the other bumbling bits to sell this dual identity, but I do especially like when he's acting in that way in order to perform a save. And that's very much the track that Morrison and Quietly took in All-Star Superman, where every time he's doing that, and it's great. I love that.
There's that whole episode where he visits Lex.
Yes.
Issue where he visits Lex in prison as Clark, which is basically an homage to that entire bit. Just everything that he does in that issue, to maintain his secret identity and yet protect. It's just great.
This is so minor, but I do one thing that and again, when we talk about how Lois finds out the secret, I don't know that I really feel, how she tests whether or not he's Superman.
Right.
I don't know that I feel too strongly between the two versions, but what I did really like in the Donner cut, that opening scene, is that Perry gives them the assignment to go to Niagara Falls to pose as the newlywed couples. And Clark is like, I'm in the middle of my series on the city council.
Yeah.
Tiny bit, but I like that. I just sort of like this notion of, we might not be seeing it, but he's got this whole life as a reporter, and who knows what he's bringing forth through his stories. I like that.
There are other writers have, comics writers over the years have played with this, and they played with it. Obviously, that was really because of budgets and what have you. That was the core of the Adventures of Superman TV show, is that Clark as a crusading reporter was very much a part of the show. And
you don't have to tell me.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, his day-to-day life was as important as his quote unquote night gig. You don't see that as much in the movies, but it's also the choice that they made. It's not just, it's the city council. Let's not forget, this is a post-Watergate world. And, the context here isn't just that he is fighting for truth, justice, and the American way. And he isn't just doing it when he's wearing a cape. And so the shorthand for the city council is what he's doing is that he's looking into corruption. And he's using his other skills, his skills as a journalist, his skills as a reporter, that he's able to do things there that he can't do as Superman, actually. I mean, it may seem like I'm extrapolating a lot, but I don't think that I am. I think that was very intentional to say, it could have been, and the other thing was that in the first movie, I think he says, great job on that nursing home expose, Kent.
Yeah.
Exactly. Taking care of his role as, that was the reason from the beginning that they made Clark Kent a reporter, was the idea that he was going to be close to the action and was able to know what was going. It gave him access that he ordinarily wouldn't have if he had done something else. And I think with this, it just shows it reinforces that idea and also expands upon it by saying that, he lives because a lot of people say, why does he need a Clark Kent at all?
In fact, he says it to Jor-El in the special edition of Superman the movie.
Right,
you must maintain your secret identity. Why?
Why? Right, exactly. And it's true, because remember, he may be physically immortal, let's say, putting it in quotes, but he's not emotionally immortal. He's a human being. Yeah. He was raised on Earth. He has deep feelings. He has his anxieties. He has his needs and wants. And if you're Superman, you could go crazy going around the world and never stopping. The mental taxation that would, it really, not to overthink it, but do think about it for a minute. I mean, you would think that Superman would need a break. And so if he's going to have this balance in his life, well, he's not going to spend the rest of his time. I mean, he could become a pro football player. They've always shown that he could have made millions by hiding in a different way, but no, he chooses to dedicate his other part of his life so that his entire life is dedicated to doing good things. It's actually brilliant, and I do like that. She's more in it for the glory. She likes getting the big story, but for her it's more about the action. She likes doing good work, but she's thinking about Pulitzer and Nobel. While he's thinking about, corruption at the city hall. And it is, and even then it's the type of stories that she gravitates to in the first movie where Perry chastises her. She's like, she's doing this whole thing, this mad rapists, making sense of senseless killings. And he's like, stop throwing me your rinky-dink tabloid garbage. There are reasons for doing what they do. have similarities because they do among all journalists, but there are also very distinct differences.
Absolutely. So we follow this with the scene in the hotel room where he trips on the bearskin rug and his hand goes into the fire.
Yeah.
And this is what allows Lois to confirm that Clark is indeed Superman. I love this scene for a number of reasons. I love the fact that he legitimately trips. Yeah. Now, maybe there is something to what Lois said where he's like, I didn't mean to do that. And he's like, well, maybe not with your mind, but maybe with your heart.
Yeah.
So, but I love the fact that he as Clark, he puts on this act, yet in that moment, he legit tripped.
Yeah.
I like that. And I like the frustration that he displays, and then when he gets up and he has his back to her, and then he does that same sort of magic trick, right? Yep. Where he turns around and it's like, now Superman
you
is
see
here.
His shoulders rise again, and you're like, oh my God, he's going to tell her, he's going to cop to it, and then he turns around, and even though he's got the dorky haircut, he's Superman.
Yeah,
that face, that square jaw, that great Christopher Reeve face that has been hidden, and it's just, it really does make it really is remarkable how he was able to sell Clark. And in that scene where he just finally decides the jig is up. I can't keep this up anymore. She knows. And so he doesn't even know what to make of it. He doesn't know what to do really. I mean, he's confused and she's just, even though she quote unquote knew, she'd been convinced that it wasn't, and now she gets the payoff. But she's also just like, and I think it was very interesting that they have her on the floor while he's standing on a pedestal. He's standing on the deck of that ridiculous bed, and she's down on the floor looking up at him with eyes tearing up, just like, I'm in love with you. And he pauses and he's like, boy, we really need to talk.
Yeah, we should talk. I'm in love with you.
We really need to talk. And and he never says he loves her back, but which I also think is an interesting choice. But he even seems, when she says that, a little bit surprised that she does. He knows it, but when I think the difference is, like you were saying earlier, it's not that just she was infatuated with him or she had the hots for him, but when she actually says, I'm in love with you. I mean, that's a hard thing, I think, for people in that stage of, it's an easy thing to say, when if you've been with someone for a long time and whatever. I mean, it is easy for me to say. I mean, some people, I guess it's difficult, but in that moment, that's her revelation. It's not just that she likes him or is turned on by him or anything. It's like, I'm in love with you. And so there's the way she delivers the line and it lands. And so I do think that it's an incredibly intimate and romantic scene, and one that really, as a viewer, particularly when I was younger, when you're conditioned to think that Superman would never reveal his identity, that he would always find a way to get out of it, there's a realness to that scene. You're just like, oh wow, what happens now?
Yeah.
What next?
I mean, well, and obviously we're coming up to what next, and their relationship goes to the next level. And that's one of the other big picture things about this movie. Yes, the fact that we were able to achieve the spectacle of the battle in the streets of Metropolis was really amazing. But the fact that this movie went there with the romantic side of the character, no prior iteration of the character.
It not only went there, it went to bed. I mean, it wasn't even just kissing and then the lights go down. I mean, they show them in bed. I mean, that was it. I remember my mom didn't like that. It wasn't out of prudery. She just was like, that's not what Superman should be. It's just, I don't need to see Superman in bed. It shouldn't. She thought that was a step too far. I was okay with it. But it was kind of an interesting, the intergenerational, and my mother was not a prude, and she was not judgmental in that way. She just didn't think it fit the character or fit the tone of the movie. But yeah, they decided that they were going to go all the way in on this being an adult relationship. And that was, pardon the pun, that was balls.
That's the thing. I feel like it's easy for us, and especially newer fans, to take this for granted, because most of the modern tellings across media
Right.
have this as a baked in part of the story.
Right.
But this,
they've been married.
yeah, but this was different.
Married
and I really
now.
do applaud them for going there. And like that has come up in recent episodes. And going back to Adventures of Superman, a lot of those fans, they view George Reeves in this paternal sense. That Superman was more of a father figure. This Superman is a lover.
Yeah.
It's a different angle. Now, Lois's "I'm in love with you," I'm of two minds with this. On the one hand, I say to myself, have we really seen enough to totally buy this? He saved her a few times across the two movies that we've seen so far. And of course, we had their quote unquote date in the first. I feel like we have to pin a lot on that date to buy that she's in love with him. But maybe that date and that flight, maybe all of that was sufficient. But then I say I'm of two minds, because then I say to myself too, well, now she has the complete picture. And this kind, caring guy who she's been with all this time, who she didn't see in this way, now the puzzle pieces sort of fit together.
Maybe.
And that might be the way I need to look at this for the "I'm in love with you" to make more sense to me. It makes enough sense in a movie, a movie, but I don't know. When I just think about what we've seen, that's a pretty big leap, I think.
It is. And I think that's a lot of headcanon there. But I think it works. I think it makes sense. I think it's certainly a logical explanation if these things can ever be logical. But when I look at it and I know how sincere she is, it's also about, again, I think, stripping away the facade. They're both stripping away their facade there. He is giving up his identity, or showing his real identity, where she is too. She's showing him her vulnerable side. The side that he doesn't necessarily see, but in the very debatable way of her inner monologue during the first movie, all of that in her mind it's a love letter. I mean, this is someone who's super cynical and jaded and tough and, is driven and has, incredible smarts and all of this. And here comes this guy that she didn't think, not only did she not think that he could exist in terms of his abilities, she didn't think that this guy could exist as a man. You could tell that this is just something he appeals to her in ways that are, well, it makes sense. I mean, so I never questioned it. I never questioned it. I think that there's enough there to be extrapolated, and also because things happen in between movies.
Yeah, well, fair enough.
Yeah.
I do love, it's a tiny little bit, but I do love where they're addressing the fact that they need to talk, and Clark, this now revealed Superman, says they can't stay there because Perry's going to be calling to check in.
I know.
Which, first of all, they don't have to answer. But I love the fact that this God is like, oh, like the boss is calling. I love that. Was a nice look overall. And I laid out this thesis in the last episode, but it continues here. Overall, I have always looked at this version of Superman as a little bit removed for me. I like the more Clark is who I am, Superman is what I can do approach to the character. But rewatching them and really rewatching them as closely as I have been and watching the performance as specifically, there is so much humanity and inner conflict and relatability in this version of Superman. And I have a newfound appreciation for this. So I'll reiterate that. But so then we go to the fortress. And this is now, we're really going to get down to business here. But they show up at the fortress, this whole business about, are you cold? No, I feel like I should be, but I'm not. He's like, good. We have this scene, and this is not in the Donner cut, and I really, really like this scene where he's at the crystal console, and he's talking to her about how after my father died, my Earth father, I came here, and this is where I learned who I really am and what I need to do. This scene serves a very mechanical plot function because we need him to take out that original green crystal and show it to her so that she can leave it, and it's not part of what's destroyed later on.
Right.
And that's the way he gets his powers back in the theatrical cut. I get that. But I liked hearing him talk about Jonathan, even for that line. I liked that acknowledgement of that. And I liked the fact that it's his father. And then he has to correct and say, my Earth father. But in his mind, that's his dad.
Right.
Oh, I like that a lot. And just the fact that it's one thing to take her there. That's huge, obviously. Yeah. But to then talk to her about his past and how he got to that point. And I like too when he says this crystal helped me build this place. Well, actually, it kind of built it for me.
Yeah, right.
Which is true. I'd forgotten that line. And when he said
called to me,
and when he said the first part, I'm like, it did all the work for you. And then he said it, and I was like, oh, that's great. I really like that.
Yeah, I do too. I like the Perry line also, but it's really just a device because the whole point is they want to get him to the fortress. But I think it would have been just as funny if they said, we can't talk here because look at this place. Yeah. How could they have a serious conversation with a pink bear?
That would have been great if he's like, Lois, this place is ridiculous. We need to get out of here.
and I do like the cute line, let's go to my place, which is also, code and so he takes her there and he even says, look, if you know now, then you should know everything. And which I think is a good way of him just giving in to and it's also because he's in love with her. Right. And he realizes what is the point of any pretense at this point. And so if I am in for a penny, in for a pound.
And we see this echoed in other stories as well. Obviously my mind always goes to Smallville, but in the 100th episode, when he reveals his secret to Lana, he does it by taking her to the fortress. And then later with Lois, after she knows the secret, he gives her the Veritas journals with all the Kryptonian lore. And he says, I want you to know all of me, right? It's not enough that, okay, you know about my powers and I told you I'm from Krypton, but this is the full picture. I want you to have this. So I like that. And I also love too, she's like, you live here? He's like, well, I live in an apartment a few blocks from you.
Yeah.
Which is great. And so then there's this bit of him going to fly and he picks out flowers. There's a deleted scene where he uses his heat vision to make a souffle. And there's some innuendo there because we were just tight on them as the shot begins. And it's like, I've never done this before. Right. Don't do it too fast or whatever. That's humorous. Yeah. And then this dinner scene between the two of them. Yeah. And this is interesting. This has always bugged me. It doesn't really anymore. But when she says, like, it must be hard being Clark. And he's like, not really. Like, even if I do make a fool of myself sometimes, but I kind of like it. Yeah. And he says, if it weren't for him, I wouldn't have met you. And she calls him, well, not calls him out, but she does point out sort of the dichotomy of this and how difficult it is to reconcile. It's like, but you are him, like it's confusing. Yeah. And again, in my mind, I never look at the character as seeing himself in that way, as Clark is this other persona. Yeah. But in this context, it makes sense. And what I really like though is the payoff when he says, because she says it's so confusing, and he's like, not to me. Yeah. For the first time, I'm seeing things clearly. Yeah. So you just see the pieces of his life really come together here. I liked it a lot.
Yeah, I think between both of them, you're seeing two characters, and also character types. These are archetypes. These are you're seeing them in a way that you had not in the comics, not in any other media had ever seen them before, and that's really as people, and it's for both of them. And those scenes are very moving in the sense that. And they're very romantic in the sense that you are seeing two people show each other who they are, and also some of the natural questions she would have, like how do you put up with being Clark? And he's like, it's not so bad. And for the reasons that we also know is that it also allows him, and he says it about meeting her, but you can also extrapolate there is that it also does allow him into places that he ordinarily, again. Maybe a bit too much headcanon here, but it does go back to, there's an echo at least of the idea that being Clark has its advantages. And in a big picture, it's the advantage of being able to live among us. Yeah. And being able to be a human being.
And as Jor-El says in the first movie, if you didn't have a secret identity, people would rely on you too much.
Constantly. So he has, in a certain way, Clark is a haven for him, but also Clark is a tool. His ability, like again, going back to before about the city council and, the nursing home exposés and stuff like that. He can't do that as Superman. He's not going to go looking, through documents. And I suppose he could. Batman does that, but he does it at night when he breaks into a place. Superman, it's just not his thing. As Clark, though, it makes sense.
So now we have the betting and the becoming human. And this is where I feel like the two cuts diverge to me the most significant way. In the theatrical cut, which is our primary focus here, he communes with Lara, as we've been hitting on. We don't have Marlon Brando as Jor-El here, essentially because of money. He would have been entitled to a share of the film's profits had he been in this. So even though he had already filmed scenes, they cut them out. They would, of course,
legal stuff,
be inserted back into the Donner cut. But here he has this conversation with Lara. before he goes to bed with Lois. Lois is present, though.
Yeah.
And this is the same in both cuts, whether he's talking to Lara or Jor-El. Lois is there, doesn't say anything. You have to imagine that he's aware of her presence.
Well, I wonder about that. Is he aware or is he not? Because she walks in from the other room and she's basically in her let's go to bed outfit. And I think to myself, it's almost like she walks in on, like I imagine, headcanon, imagine, and I'm only thinking of this now, but imagine it. I guess it always struck me as the idea is that she was getting herself presentable. She was in the bathroom or whatever, passed for a bath.
And we know from Miss Tessmacher they have a bathroom.
Yeah, right, exactly. So it's got some kind, whatever it is, she was changing, let's say. And it was like he was calling his mom.
Yeah.
He was like on the phone with his mom. He was like, normally you wouldn't call your mom in that situation. I don't think, but in this particular case, because of what's at stake, he feels the need to call his mom, and she walks in, and I'm not so sure that he was aware that she was there. I'm not. I just don't know. I don't know. I don't think it's clear.
I don't think it's clear either. There might be a stronger case in the Donner cut where Jor-El gives her the side eye, which is amazing. But at that point, Clark still isn't seeing her. Here's the thing. I hope that he was aware of her presence. I agree with you that the way it plays and the way it's staged, his back is to her, and he's having what he thinks is a private moment because she's off elsewhere.
Right.
So I think there probably is a fair argument, and he's also in this moment here. So maybe he, even though he has these enhanced senses, maybe he's not aware. In my mind, though, I hope he is, because otherwise this is a huge unilateral decision he makes without talking to her.
Right.
So I kind of hope that he's aware. I want to talk about what the substance of the conversation is, but I guess they go hand in hand. But I feel like the takeaway that people, myself included, have had from the theatrical cut over the years. Tell me, you might have had a different takeaway, but I feel like the takeaway has been, because he gives up the powers before they go to bed, it's that he has to do that.
Right.
That he can't have sex with a human.
Right. That was always my takeaway.
That was always your takeaway. Yeah. That always was my takeaway. I genuinely feel that's what people have gleaned from that. I think that was the lesson Smallville took from that, and they stuck with that until season 9, and then finally they were able to, to move past that. But I think that was a takeaway. It's interesting because when you look at the sequence, yes, it happens first in the theatrical cut, but when you really listen to what they're saying to each other, it's certainly not explicit that he has to do it. It's more about if you're going to live with one of them or live as one of them, then it follows you must be one of them. I don't know. I guess my question is, do you think we've had the right takeaway about what the intention was?
I think that, remember, we're dealing with a PG movie.
Yeah, fair. Yeah.
And I think that they weren't going to say, they were never going to get into the biology of it.
Fair.
If they were, it would have been in a jokey way. I think there was never going to be the conversation, particularly with his mother. Maybe they would have with Jor-El. I don't know. But even so, it's still a PG movie. I think that this was code. That this is the way that they needed to present it. That if you want to be with her, in other words, be with her, you've got to be like her. Because otherwise the presumption is that because of your power or because of whatever, that something could go wrong or you wouldn't, And that was always I always saw that was just a nuanced way of having that conversation.
I think you're probably right. I mean, when you hear in terms of what they actually say, he says she's everything I've wanted in life, and she asks, does she feel the same way? He's like, yes. And essentially this bit about you then must become one of them, and are you sure? And he's like, yeah. It's a very, very condensed version of the Kal-El Jor-El scene that's in the Donner cut. It's the same core idea, but truncated. And to me, this is a failing of the theatrical cut. It doesn't bother me so much, actually, that it's Lara instead of Jor-El. Mm-hmm. And maybe you can even make an argument, well, the two of them were present as he was departing Krypton, and Jor-El had the first movie, and now Lara's going to be here for the second movie. But I wanted more here. And I feel like where the Donner cut really sings is that there's far more of that inner conflict that Clark is going through and that tension between the two of them. I really, really like that back and forth. I feel like this massive decision that Clark is making here in the theatrical cut, I feel like it's not given its proper, it feels too perfunctory to me. And this is also, again, watching the two cuts back to back. So I have in my head and I'm making that comparison.
I'm gonna go back to my mom, because at the time she didn't like this whole aspect, and it wasn't just because. And again, but it's interesting because we debated this back then. We had this conversation then in a slightly different way, but she got very angry with Lois for letting it happen. She saw Lois as a very selfish person for allowing this, knowing what he was giving up and knowing what the world was losing just so that she could be with him. She actually put it at Lois's feet and saying that he's making a decision here that she is empowered to stop. And she lets it happen because it's something she wants for herself. And actually the movie does address this. We have later on, she's, I'm selfish. Oh, no, you're not selfish. She goes, no, I am selfish. I just want you for myself. And that's true. And it is absolutely, when you put it in that context and you look at it that way, look, it's his decision to make. He's a grown up. He can make the decision. However, you're right. It's a unilateral decision. But because we do know that she's in the room and she hears this and lets it all go and watches it happen, and she says, I can't believe what you've just given up for me. It speaks to her that she still loves him, even though he can't fly anymore. But at the same time, she is willingly being a party to basically taking Superman away from the world. And while he has the right to do that, he may say, I've had enough of this. I'm exhausted. I've done my part. On her, is it so easy for her to allow that to happen? I don't know. Is it her responsibility? I don't know. But I just remember having this debate with my mother back when I was a teenager.
Honestly, I think I'm with your mom on this. I think you do. It's so tricky with this because for our story to unfold,
right,
we need this to happen.
Yes.
If they have a conversation and then she really becomes a willing participant in this,
right.
I don't know how well that plays. Her standing there and not speaking up, that is not the best either.
No.
So it really is tough. And it does beg this question because when we get to that diner scene and Clark's been thrown through the glass and she's like, I want the man I fell in love with. And he's like, well, he's not here or he's gone or whatever the line is. I don't know. I think my biggest criticism of either cut of the movie, of just Superman 2 overall, my biggest gripe is that I just wish we had more time to explore the powerless Kal-El.
Yeah.
Because it's such a fast, instant regret and it's such a fast turnaround. And I would have wanted to see more of what is their day-to-day like? And is she happy with this version of him? And because this goes back to this question of who or what does she really love?
What you're looking for is a TV show, though, not a movie.
I think
in a movie, let's also. I mean, yes, you're right about that. And from a storytelling standpoint, you want more of it. You want more of it. It would make sense for it to unfold a little bit more. But and it is very quick that he goes back and let's walks back to the North Pole.
Yeah, as you do.
as you do. Well, I don't know where the Arctic Patrol was then, but did you give him a lift?
Given him a ride.
and then the ice trucker that goes right by him as if that guy in the middle of nowhere is going to hurt him. Clearly he's in distress, but the guy just goes right by him. And it's also that guy is not going to drive him to the Fortress of Solitude either.
Oh, that's true. That guy though was clearly one of the guys who had been in the diner.
I don't want to
deal with that guy. Who else is even around? He's clearly one of those guys.
Could have been Rocky.
That's amazing. Drives by, gives him the finger. That would have been amazing.
Right, screw you, pal.
No, the thing is though, I hear you. All I'm saying is one more scene. I just needed all I needed was a bridge. That's all. I just needed a bridge from giving up the powers to I need to go. I mean, before the diner scene. That's what I needed. But I will say, so I just wish we had a little bit more in this back and forth with Lara. It just feels perfunctory, especially compared to what was taken out. I do kind of like that he's in his Superman garb. Then he goes into the chamber and he comes out powerless in his white button down and slacks. He's become human, and now his
hair his hair is between the Superman hair and the Clark hair. Yeah. It's just a soft, relaxed haircut.
Yeah. So he's now can be with her. So right. I do sort of like that transformation aspect. Now, this is the instance where I have to talk about the Donner cut, because those scenes between Kal-El and Jor-El, that to me, that's the heart of that movie there, where they have this whole conversation. And it's much more, in this instance, he's already had sex with Lois. Mm-hmm. So it's not a matter of, we don't have to try to interpret what they're saying. It's not a matter of he needs to do that, but it's more this more ideological debate. And Jor-El says, you can't serve humanity if you invest all of your time in one of them. Because at the start of the scene, Clark is saying, the feelings I've developed, my attachment, they've affected me. And Jor-El says, you can't have both. And Clark says, because Jor-El says, if you wish to serve humanity, he's like, and if I no longer wish to serve humanity? Mm-hmm. And Jor-El essentially calls him selfish. Like, that's how you repay their gratitude, by pursuing your selfish interests. And this is, you talk about the humanity, the fallibility, the hubris, whatever you want to call it. Clark's like, selfish? After all I've done for them, will there ever come a time when I've served enough? Yeah. And the way he speaks, I feel like it's that classic Juilliard training in Christopher Reeve coming. I love this back and forth.
But it's also a great back and forth between father and son.
Yeah.
You know, the wisdom of the father and the impulsiveness of the son. And it is a very different type of approach to that conversation. And it is very father and son. It is interesting, because of, obviously it was not intentional, but what ultimately turned out to be two very different takes on the same conversation. And one is very much the difference between a mother and a son versus a father and a son. And a father, and I know that's pat, and I'm being, I'm being stereotypical here, but when you think of archetypes, the father talks about duty and being a guardian and your responsibilities, and the mother talks about the heart. Now, of course, it's not that in real life. It's much more nuanced than that, but it works dramatically. It works because of what we're dealing with here. So it isn't interesting that with the idea of Jor-El, it's a different debate than it is with his mother. With Laura, who has a different point of view, but also here's what's interesting is that if again you go back to the first movie and the debate that Jor-El and Laura had when they're putting him away, putting him in the starship, and he says, in a very cold fact, it comes off as cold, and I think that's intentional, where he's like, I'm going to send him to a place where he can survive, and not just survive, but thrive and be basically a god. And he's going to need that advantage to be able to withstand whatever he's going to need to withstand. And she's like, you're basically sending him there to be a freak. He will never be, he will always be alone if you do this. And his response is he will never be alone. And that's where the AI comes in. So there is that philosophical debate between the two of them. So I think when you think about Laura's advice to him, or Laura's point of view, is very much in keeping with what little we see of her character. And Jor-El has that more, it's more of a philosophical issue with him, and hers is more of an emotional one, which I think is very interesting.
No, that's a great point. And in that Laura scene where she says to Clark, does Lois feel the same way? I love that. I still just wanted.
Yeah, that is, you're right. That is.
I think I just wanted, so I agree with that. I still just wanted more with Clark and Laura. I just wanted more of a back and forth. I wanted her to push him a little bit more. Mm-hmm. If she had said something in the vein of, you feel this way now, but you might not always in the future.
And that's what a parent would say too.
Right.
That's an essential part of that conversation. And as a parent of an adult son, that is the nature of many conversations. And the older your kids get, that becomes you may feel that way now. Are you sure that is the path that you want to take? Are you sure? Yeah, I'm sure. Or like, well, have you considered this? And you play the Socratic sort of, because you can see the things that they cannot see. And because if you think back to yourself, you couldn't see it either. And the only reason you can see things a certain way is through perspective and time, and not because of, and I do think that, and you're right. I think that is a, I don't want to overthink it. I think you're absolutely right in terms of the reality of that conversation. But I also can't escape the fact that, if the movie goes too long, they only get so many showings in a day, and therefore don't make enough money. They have to, and let's also not forget that that this movie is an interesting. It also came at an interesting time in movie making in Hollywood. This was a blockbuster studio epic at a time when Hollywood had shifted its focus. The fact that this conversation is had at all in this movie, to any extent, was groundbreaking. And remember, movies not too long before would have people fall in love instantly.
Yeah.
I mean, you just put two people a man and a woman in the same room, and within 15 minutes, they're in love with each other. And it's like, where did that come from? They showed no reason. There was here, at least, I don't want to say they pay lip service. I think they paid as much attention to it as they could under the circumstances, not just in terms of runtime, but also keep the kids engaged. They're playing at multiple levels here. At some point, you can't take them out of the Superman for too long before the kids start getting itchy.
No, fair enough. This is probably an instance of knowing the other version that exists.
Right.
That hit the sweet spot for it. So I think that's also what I have here. But the Jor-El piece, it's just fascinating to me because it is this more ideological thing. You cannot have both. You have to choose. And the implication,
which, by the way, I'm not so sure that is true.
Well, so that's actually one of the things. But actually, before that, so Clark clearly is seeing this as, okay, I have this binary choice, and it seems like, well, there's no alternative to being Superman, so I guess I have to give up Lois. And that's when he says, is there no other way? Right. And Jor-El presents this red sun chamber that can strip him of his powers, but he can be hurt, he can be killed, and really tries to get Kal-El to reconsider. And he just says, I love her. And he flies and he goes through. But this whole idea is really an outlier, especially when we look at all of these modern stories where he is in a relationship and in fact married to Lois. Yeah. We see tons of stories where he's able to navigate and balance, and it can create some tension and present storytelling opportunities. Mm-hmm. It highlights the role that Lois plays in keeping him grounded and all of that.
I think they're great as a married couple.
I agree wholeheartedly. So you might expect me to have an issue with this whole take from Jor-El, but I actually, in this context, it works for me. And if we're really talking the Donner more mythic, biblical take on the character and this wisdom from Jor-El, this directive that he's given, I can buy.
The voice of God, really.
Right. This is the choice that he has to make. He cannot have both. And I like that. I really think it works in this context for me. And also, not to be glib about it, and this is for a younger audience, they're not going to get into this, but let's not also forget, in the Donner cut, he's just had sex for the first time. So he was not thinking straight. And so all of the stuff that
I want to do this again, Dad.
Well, Jor-El.
What have I been missing? I've been flying around tirelessly, and nobody told me it was going to be like this.
Well, because Jor-El says to him, he's like, surely, I'm paraphrasing, but essentially the feeling that you've gotten from saving people, surely that means something to you.
Not like this,
and he says, what I feel for Lois is stronger. And it's like, yeah, I'm sure it is, man.
30-year-old virgin.
This is, I want to be mindful of the time, so I don't want to dwell on this, but it is kind of an interesting thing. Very recently, I don't know if you watched Superman and Lois, but very, very mild spoiler, but we find out via flashback that Clark was a virgin before Lois in that show, which is also what we saw on Lois and Clark. Right. And clearly the intention here was that Clark had not been intimate with a woman before. The Snyderverse is not explicit. I think, especially kind of knowing how Snyder views things, that Clark had probably had sex before, but we're not told. Smallville is really the big outlier here, where he has sex with Lana, albeit without his powers. But yeah, this whole thing about Clark being a virgin and so many of these stories, it's like, come on, if someone chooses to, that's totally fine. But the guy doesn't have to be a monk. But it's just interesting here. Another instance of that. But yes, let's not forget, especially in that Donner cut version, that there's that going on. But in any event, now we have the depowered Clark and the diner scene, the infamous diner scene. Yeah. Well, the first of them.
Yeah, it's great, and I think it does wrap up a lot. I mean, the whole, Clark comes out, wants to, is as he would the knight in shining armor, and he doesn't have to pretend he's Clark anymore. He can act like Superman, only he doesn't have Superman's powers, and he finds out very quickly what it is like to be a human being in that situation. Now, of course, it's Pat. But it works. And I think, he gets his ass kicked, and then he immediately finds out about Zod. And now he's really filled with regret. And I think it's just a really well done scene. The actor who plays Rocky, was a character actor who popped up. I mean, you'd see him all the time in like 70s movies playing a tough guy, either a henchman, a thug, or whatever. And he shows up here, and he's just disgusting, and you could tell it's like even the people who are in the place are just tired of this guy. He's the Arctic bully, wherever they are, he's the bully, and they all know him. And it's like, come on, Rocky, like leave it alone, stop it. But Rocky's not going to be, because Rocky's an asshole. But the look on Clark's face when he sees the TV, where you been, pal? On a desert island, and I also like how they have Brooklyn accents in the Arctic. I think that's important. But the look on his face, the horror of he realizes what he's done, and that he does still feel that sense of responsibility. And when it dawns on him, and then he has to be the prodigal son, he has to return, and he has to walk to the North Pole. But anyway, I think that's a very effective scene.
It is. While I wanted something else before it, does accomplish a lot. Yeah. And like you said, the bumbling Clark pretense is gone. And then he says, someone ought to teach you some manners. And then, excuse me, sir, would you care to step outside?
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where I say to myself, I guess we kind of talked about this last year when we talked about the diner scene in Superman and Lois, where it's a kind of an updated take on this, where maybe he saw Pa deal with a bully like this at some point in time, or something to that effect. But I mean, Rocky fights dirty, hits him from behind, and then when Clark comes back for more, sucker punches him. It's pretty vicious. It escalates very quickly, and it's funny. I feel like historically, when I've looked at this scene, the horror on Clark's face after he's knocked down for the first time, I always felt like,
his
whoa,
blood.
like this.
He sees his blood.
But I think I was always like, whoa, like this is a little over the top. But no, it does track, right? That he's not experienced this before. Right. And so it's the shock of the pain and the experience, and then also
and the humiliation.
And the beginning of this realization. He doesn't know about Zod yet, but it's the beginning of oh no, right? And Lois's line about, I want the man I fell in love with. He's gone.
Yeah.
And then, yes, when they see that news footage, and Lois says, like, you couldn't have known. And he says, in the theatrical cut, he says, they knew. In the Donner cut, he says, he knew.
Yeah.
Right? Like, he made a mistake. He went after what he wanted. He did make a selfish choice. Yeah. Whether warranted or not, that's debatable. What does he actually owe the people?
It's not just what does he owe the people, but I mean, look, he again, he's not a cold, unfeeling, scientifically minded, logical Vulcan / Kryptonian. He's a human being who has the same wants, needs, desires, fallibilities as the rest of us. He just can do amazing things. So from an emotional standpoint, who could blame him for just wanting what everybody wants, and why should he be denied that because of his, I mean, it is selfish, but it's also understandable.
That's the thing. When I say selfish, I mean more in the literal sense, not making a kind of a judgment about it. He makes a choice for himself.
Yeah. But at the same time, you can't blame him for feeling that. Although there is a part of me that says, I don't know. I've never been faced with the choice, and I never will be. But I don't know what it would be like to give up that kind of power. Yeah. You know, I don't know if, particularly if you are so driven to do great things, I don't know. But love makes you make decisions that are not always logical. So,
and so now he once again makes the pilgrimage
to
the fortress, beaten up, bloodied. And in the theatrical cut, he finds
in a light jacket,
the green, windbreaker. Yeah. He finds that green crystal, that original green crystal that he had shown Lois and that she had inadvertently discarded and thankfully spared it from destruction after the whole sun chamber business. And it lights up.
It calls to him.
Yes, it calls to him. It's fine. Yeah. It's fine the way this plays. I mean, were you... I guess historically, but especially now knowing the other version of this, are you satisfied with this? Is this enough to sort of say, all right, I get how he gets his powers
Even
back
then, I thought, I remember the first time I saw it, I was like, oh. But in repeated viewings, it's pat, you know, because you would, given the nature of the AI and given the nature of everything that we had seen, the fact that green crystal could have restored everything, that why it wasn't destroyed, or because it destroys the console, but it doesn't, you know, it doesn't also somehow destroy. It's just something I've chosen not to think too much about. Yeah. Okay. All right. It's, that's still there, you know? Okay. Well, there you go. But I do like the part where it just kind of, it does light up. Mm-hmm. And that I think is fitting in the sense that he says even before, it called to me, and it does again.
Yeah, it works well enough. To me, it pales in comparison to what we get with Kal-El and Jor-El, where he appears and makes this sacrifice and says, just how I gave my life to send you to Earth, now I will expend the last of my energies to restore you. He's like, no, Father, no. Yeah. And even before that, when Clark gets there, he's like, I failed. I failed you. I failed the people. He's like, I opted for submission in a world ruled by your enemies, he says. And then Jor-El makes this sacrifice, expends the last of his energy, says the prophecy will now be fulfilled. The son becomes the father, the son. It just, to me, ties so much of this together, and you feel the sense of loss. And then towards the end of the Donner cut, when he destroys the fortress, you feel that. And Jor-El is gone. The location has been compromised. I think that is it for the fortress. And it really feels that, and it just sort of bookends that first movie. So I love that whole sequence, you know. And then, of course, that kind of takes us to what we've already talked about, where we get to this big climax in Metropolis. Is there any better line than General, would you care to step outside?
There is none.
And is there any better sin than the Donner cut replacing it with, haven't you ever heard of freedom of the press?
I don't know why in the world, of all the choices that is the line. It's actually the best line.
Yeah.
Not only just in the movie, but you could argue in the first two movies. Because now because at this point now you have watched, you know, 2 and a half hours, 2 hours and 40 minutes of the first Superman movie. You know what he can do. You know what is at stake. You know what he has given up. You saw what just happened to him without his powers when he you know, at the diner, and his you know, that moment. First off, the buildup is great, where they show the newspapers and you hear the music bump, bump,
that's
bump,
so good.
And you hear the wind, and then you see things start to flip, bump, 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 and I'm getting chills just thinking about it. And then he lands, of course, on the flagpole, you know, the American flagpole. That's his way, you know. That's how he presents himself, and he's back, and he's not afraid, and he does, you know, General, you care to step outside? Is a supremely badass Superman moment. And you're right. It was, when I saw the Donner cut, I'm like, they did what? They couldn't let Lester have that one moment.
It's the sort of thing.
Great scene.
It's the sort of thing where replacing the fireplace scene with the screen test, it's like, okay, you're trying to show us what the plan was going to be. And okay. But that line, it's so iconic.
Yeah. It's such a great line.
It's fantastic. And I love
and fitting in the character. And
and thematically, he dealt with a bully as a human, and he's dealing with 3 bullies from Krypton. Yeah. Oh man. It's so good.
And it's also a great way of just showing, I am not afraid of you.
Yeah.
You know, I'm challenging you to the fight, you know.
I want to get to that extra skirmish that's added at the fortress, where we get some pretty wonky additional powers here. But
well, that's actually throughout the movie. You know, first off, the finger laser powers, and the you know, the levitation powers. So where'd that all come from?
Yeah.
And how come Superman doesn't have the same powers that they have? Or where does that happen? And also, just not for nothing, because I can't let us finish without mentioning two things. You get the kid in East Houston, please, Daddy, please. It sounds like Oliver Twist because they filmed it in England. Please, Daddy, please let my daddy down. And then you have the same thing in Metropolis where the kid's saying, "Hey, Superman didn't do nothing." With a Cockney. I'm like, they couldn't fix that in post.
I know.
They could. I mean, why would they? It's so weird to me.
I know that's something. If you don't get that on the day, if you don't nail it, that's what ADR is for.
Right. You just go later and you go and just dub it in. What would make the difference? It is so weird that those two bits made it through the editing process. You get the kids in Metropolis and the kid in East Houston, and they have British accents. It's so weird to me.
I know.
But going back to the weird powers that they have that Superman doesn't have, why? Oh, also, how come they can talk in space?
Yeah, I gave up complaining about that. I was like, yeah, they can in this movie. They can.
They're on the moon. Did you see what he did? What they're talking?
Yeah, I just gave up on that. I don't disagree.
And even in the Donner cut, the Donner shot these scenes. And freedom.
I know. Well, the stuff in the small town, and again in the Donner cut, they cut around a lot of those bits, like.
Because that was shot by Lester.
Ursa, so Ursa arm wrestling the guy and all the finger beam stuff.
Yeah. The arm wrestling the guy I kind of liked. I thought that was fun.
Non trying to figure out the heat vision, all that stuff they chopped out. But yeah, those extra powers, I really don't need that extra skirmish in the fortress. I feel like the battle in Metropolis was significant enough, and I liked the more mental game of chess that we get at the conclusion of the fortress scene.
Right.
Where Superman knows Lex so well. He knows Lex will betray him. So he says, get them into that chamber. And then, of course, Lex instantly says, get him in there. It'll take his powers. And we have this whole ruse that we've already talked about.
Poisonous snake.
Yeah. So that to me, and then later says, I knew you were a lying weasel. You go right to them. That to me is enough. I didn't need this extra battle. If we were going to get it, I know these powers are so effing weird. The laser beams, the cellophane S, which one of our audience members... I think it might be Brian actually, who has a question for when we get to the end of our series here. But Brian or one of our other audience members made the point that they didn't get too hung up on that. They looked at that more as a feature of the costume as opposed to a power.
Yeah, me too.
It's fine. It's funny too. You read Superman 78, the comic book.
Well, they went to that.
Yeah, so
I remember even it was I think the Wilfredo Torres, who was the artist on that first series, on Twitter says, "Yeah, we're going there," and he showed a clip of him taking off the logo. And yes, I always thought that was a feature of the costume, not that it was a specific power.
But then Superman appearing in multiple places.
Yeah.
What power do you think that is?
Speed.
Just super speed.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, that's kind of what I've always chalked it up to as well, and I think it makes enough sense. Do you know what bothered me the most about that? When he's like, well, I used to play this as a kid.
Yeah. I know.
With who?
I don't know.
Well, maybe with Mom,
the
Pa.
dog.
The
right.
dog.
It could have been with Mom, Pa, and it could have been with the dog. Yeah.
Fair enough.
It was. I remember when he. I remember why again, because it is fun to think of it back when I saw it the first time on that day. I remember the first time I saw the cellophane S, and I remember saying, "Superman can't do that. Where'd that come? Superman doesn't have a utility belt. That's unfair.
Yeah,
that just doesn't. What is that all about?" And then also the weirdness when I think it's Ursa who throws a high kick at him and goes through his body, and he turns to stone, or she kicks stone that kind of is shaped like it was weird. There's like a visual trick that when he disappears, there's like a stone version of him that's sort of left behind. I'm like, that's kind of weird too. But yeah, the whole multiple place thing, and it's headcanon because it's not explained, that the only explanation I can come up with is that it's super speed.
But on the subject of invented powers, we end the movie with the mind wipe kiss.
Ah, yes. Actually, before we do that, we've talked around it, but we've never. And one of the things that I think that why people do gravitate toward this movie over the first, I mean, it's not just the love affair, and it's not just the other stuff. It's that battle in Times Square.
Yeah.
That it's clearly a sound stage, but it is supposed to be Times Square, and that is and despite the seams that you can see, the animated manhole cover, and some of the silly comments that off to the side, are you going to pay for that? And all that kind of nonsense is, it's a great action set piece. You get to see Superman cut loose, which is not something you got to see. You got to see him do super heroics. You got to see him, catch a helicopter and reverse an earthquake. And you got to see him throw things into space, but you never saw the brawl. You never got to see Superman duking it out. And it's a very exciting, very well filmed, flying over the river, zipping back and forth, him trying to triangulate where the three of them are and everything that goes into that. I think it goes a very long way toward making this the favorite, because it is a great action battle sequence that you're not, particularly in this world of Superman, is fairly unique. But going back, yes, to the super kiss.
I don't know what to say. I guess it's troubling in the sense that, where does this come from? And I know I'm reading online, some have pointed to comic book instances where it seems like it did something similar, but then I found a CBR. Well, I found a CBR article, Comic Book Legends Revealed, right, that actually looked at one of those issues that had been cited. It was Adventures 306 maybe, where Clark does plant a quote unquote super kiss on Lois, and she's a little like disoriented is probably too strong word, but like she's stunned by kind of the passion of his kiss, but it's not that he erases her memory.
Right.
So I think people might have extrapolated a bit much from the comics to try to say, oh, there's some basis in the comics. So I think on the one hand, it's where the hell is this? And it comes out of nowhere. And to be honest, even if it had been in the comics, like for argument's sake, it's still nothing that had been established in either of these movies. So it still feels silly. Like it comes out of nowhere, and it feels silly. And the fact that, once again, we talk about these unilateral decisions, he takes it upon himself to erase her memory. Had he said, I have this crystal from the fortress, in the theatrical cut, he doesn't destroy the fortress.
Right.
If he had said, I have this crystal from the fortress, it can make you forget, however it's phrased. And she chooses to do it, something to that effect. I don't know. It's not my favorite. I don't know what to say. How do you feel about it?
Here's the interesting thing. Is it, yes, it's not a great solution to, you were living at a time when they still felt compelled to bring things back to the status quo. That they couldn't, it was too much for them to say, okay, even if he's got his powers, what would have been the harm of Lois knowing, even if they couldn't be together? She wasn't going to write about it.
Right.
It wouldn't make her love him any less. They just couldn't have had that relationship. But he probably could have used a friend like her. And she probably could have used a friend like him. So what would have been so wrong with that? But I think that's just,
no, I agree.
I think we're looking at that with 21st century eyes as opposed to 1970s. Everything's got to be reset back to the classic triangle of Clark and Lois and all of that, because that's the way it was done. And I think what this was a at best inartful way of accomplishing that. But I think that was inevitable. That's some way that was going to happen. And yes, there were better ways to do it that she could have chosen. Like, I can't bear this, but I'd rather not know, or have that conversation. But again, you're dealing with a movie, and again, I always have to put it back in the context of the time where they were making it up as they went along.
True.
And they were bringing what was already very adult themes into something that was not considered. I mean, just the mere idea of what they were dealing with in these movies, both of these movies, was groundbreaking. Was like, you didn't expect any of this. So now we're looking about what we read from comic books, and the comic books at the time, remember, weren't doing this either. These movies went well beyond what comic books were doing at the time in terms of nuanced relationships and what we are used to now. This is pre-Dark Knight. This is pre-Watchmen. This is pre-Swamp Thing. This is all years before any of the comic books caught up really to this movie and its ability to take adult themes and make them work in these kinds of worlds. So to look back on it and say all of these things, yeah, it's all true. But at the same time, I look at it and I think, well, in 1980, this is how it would have worked anyway. I don't think they were capable of doing anything beyond what they ended up doing, particularly in the confines of it being a PG movie.
Your point is well taken. I think on the one hand, to what you were saying a moment ago, the fact that it even needed to be, that genie needed to be put back in the bottle. Yeah. I agree. I wish they could have just let this play out. Yeah. As it would turn out, Lois was barely in the third movie, so it wouldn't have made much of a difference. No, I know. But when you just kind of look at the full picture, and then even in the fourth movie, I know we have the whole double date business, but Lois functions more as that sisterly confidant, I feel, more in that.
She's more like a buddy.
And like I said before, with the Donner cut, I hate the reversing time ending of the Donner cut. And to me, him flying away from that balcony is with this realization they can't be together. It's bittersweet, but it brings the story to a close and it works. Yeah, I wish we could have just left it at that. If that genie had to be put back in the bottle, yeah, this probably was just the best thing that they could come up with at the time, and it was what it was. But yes, had it been, and taking a step back, this notion, he recognizes her pain, and it is within his powers, apparently, to to help her in this respect. So I get that. But yes, had it just been Lois saying, I can't bear this. Is there something at your fortress that can help me? So, look, easy to Monday morning quarterback it all these years later. Now, the bigger question I have as we're wrapping up here, I feel like this movie, really either cut, especially the Donner one, but either cut, I feel like this movie really does show and make the point he cannot have this. He cannot have, and I don't think he can't have it with Lois. I think he can't have this in his life. He can't be Superman and have romance.
Right.
Yet in the subsequent movies, that proves not to be the case. And maybe we'll talk about it more when we get there. But it's a tough thing. And I think that's one of the aspects of the next couple of movies that's a little bit hard for me to square, because I feel like this movie really kind of lands pretty firm. And had Superman 1 and 2 just been this duology, and we didn't have the other two movies, I think this is the statement that it makes about the character. It's sort of upended when you get to the next couple of movies. But I really feel like that's what this movie is saying. What do you think? That he can't have this.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. It's part of the sacrifice of being Superman. It introduces a part of his and explains some things that are never really fully explained in the comics up to that time anyway. But yeah, the idea is that even Superman can't have everything, and that, I mean, it's not played maudlin. It is bittersweet, but he's made his peace with it at the end of the movie when he realizes that, look, it was fun while it lasted, but I have a responsibility, and I'm okay with that, because this is the world. This is not only just the life that this is my place.
Yeah, he has a higher calling.
Yeah, I have a higher calling, and there is some, he is godlike in that regard. I have bigger fish to fry, and not to get too religious, but there are others who walk among us who feel the same way. So I think that is really, I choose, when you talk about headcanon, to ignore 3 and 4 entirely.
You're probably not alone in that.
Yeah, no. I mean, to me, the story ends with Superman 2.
Yeah.
And then picks up again in the comic books whether you're talking about Jeff Johns's and Richard Donner's comic books, or whether you're talking about the Superman 78 comic books or whatever. I think those, Superman 3 and 4, Superman Returns, which attempted to ignore Superman 3 and 4, I gave it credit for the attempt, but I think that movie missed on a lot of different, on many, many different levels. It's a whole other, Yeah. But I think that, to me, their story, or that creative teams, as fractured as it was, that story was told. What we get after that is kid stuff.
Yeah. No, in this story, there was something he wanted for himself, and in the end, he had to give it up for this higher calling, this higher purpose. It's very compelling, and while some of the execution, like the mind wipe kiss, we can try to rewrite, but overall it works. And then he gets to take out his frustrations on Rocky at the diner when he goes back,
which is a great bit.
It is. It's funny. I never really thought much about it. In recent years, I've seen sort of the sentiment on social media, some feeling that Clark himself becomes a bully in that moment when he goes back. No. In the Donner cut, I agree, because time has none of it ever happened, and then he just shows up. So that's its own thing. But no, in this cut, and especially rewatching it, there's something truly satisfying about seeing that guy
get his
comeuppance, and ultimately the guy punches Clark. He hurts his hand. Clark spins him around on the chair, and then he slides him down the counter. Nothing hard. And I love the bit about paying for the damages. It's so in character.
It is in character, but then I thought to myself, because he's got a wad of cash, I'm thinking to myself, reporters don't make that much. But then I guess the damage was really, if anything, to the seat, and to the pinball machine.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that, and the tilt, and all of that. Yeah. But let me ask you this question: when they look at him, and they're just gobsmacked, and he says, I've been working out, and he's like pumping iron. The look on her face, especially, do you think they realized who it was?
That's a good question. I think maybe it's open to interpretation, because on the one hand, he got his ass kicked so egregiously the previous time that it would just be shocking that he was able to accomplish this in and of itself. And that might account for that look of surprise. Or maybe there is some sort of sense, because it's what he does. He walks a fine line. It's not to the point where, clearly this guy has powers, but it is a step above what it is, because it's not that
he doesn't just knock him out. It's theatrical.
Yeah, the way he picks him up,
the way he picks him up, the way he spins the seat, the way he pushes him down the thing. This is not something a normal tough guy could do. And the look, I just think of the look on her face is one of recognition. Like, did we just? That was Superman, or something like that, or wow, what did we just see? And which I liked. I like that button. I mean, we don't know, but that's always been my interpretation. Is like, I think she knows. I think she's like, oh my God, that's.
I had never really thought about that, but I think there might be something to that. And the last thing, real quick, I know we haven't talked a ton about Lex. Lex's role in this movie is really interesting because it's certainly. I feel there's a huge chunk of the movie where he's really off the board, but we have his escape at the beginning, and he and Miss Tessmacher making their way to the fortress and seeing either Jor-El or the other Kryptonian scientists, depending on which cut you're looking at. But this is where he learns about the three criminals who then conveniently happen to be freed at the same time he's learning this information about them. Yeah. And then he presents himself to them at the White House and tells them he can get Superman, takes them to the Daily Planet, and then ultimately leads them to the fortress. And we have this whole bit that we've already talked about. I guess I found his role here a bit superfluous, but humorous. I liked it.
He's comic relief.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's some people who, I have always looked at Hackman as a fantastic Lex Luthor, and there are others who look at him and say, no, he's too much of a joke. He's too much this. He's too funny, and he's not sinister enough. Well, he's very sinister in the first one. He's less so in the second one because by comparison, it's like, good God. And he's also still a human being. So like that great bit when Superman, thank God. I mean, go get him.
I know, it's so good.
It's just like, he's like, But I mean, again, since he's shoehorned into this movie because that's what the footage, and they didn't have any more that they could shoot with him because he wouldn't come back for, once Donna was out, he was out. So it is, but I still love his whole, I love the shtick. Is he made more of a, not a punchline, but is he there more for comic relief than I would want? Sure, but it works. He's funny. I mean, it's Gene Hackman, for crying out loud. The guy's great. So no matter what he does, his one-liners and his delivery, he's fantastic. I'm okay with it.
That's fine. I guess he serves other than humor, he serves an important enough function, I suppose. Presumably, Zod could have figured out that Daily Planet Metropolis was Superman's base of operations and gone there, but Lex leads them there.
Well, no. I mean, it makes sense from a storytelling, putting the pieces together. It makes sense.
Yeah.
But I mean, they could have they could have found another way to do it. But also just having him there, he needed to be there. He's Lex Luthor.
Yeah. The last question I have, though, I don't buy that Miss Tessmacher would help him after the events of the first movie.
Not.
And I know these were deleted scenes from Superman. But he tries to feed her.
I know, tries to feed her to the babies.
So when she's here
Feed the
helping him, I'm
babies.
like, even
no.
putting aside those deleted scenes, he tried to blow up her mother.
Yeah, right, exactly. Hackensack, New Jersey.
Yeah, so
and he looks at his watch and he just shakes his
I know.
head. Not anymore. But the you would think, but some people like bad boys.
Yeah, yes, I think we can chalk that up to that.
Yeah.
Listen, I really enjoyed this conversation. I think we did the movie, both versions, but the movie overall justice. Is there anything we didn't say or any final thoughts you want to offer before we sign off?
Oh, I'm sure I'll think of it after we sign off. No, I think that, it's, I don't love the movie like I once did, but I will always love the experience of discovering it and getting to see it under a very special, memorable circumstances. I mean, I remember like it was yesterday, Anthony. I remember it well. I remember the weather. I remember the color of the sky when we were going into the theater. It was, it was so exciting. And I mean, I had the soundtrack album and I just played it over and over and over again. You can't even find it now. I mean, I think La La Land did a version with Superman 2. But that old vinyl disc, which I would love for them to put up on Spotify because there's some slight differences. But it's still Superman and it still works and it still has such great moments that it'll always be meaningful to me. So
beautifully said. I think for me, lastly, overall, it doesn't hold up as well from start to finish as the first one. Probably due in large part to the fact that we have two directors' visions that came together here. But I think that the conflict in this movie, both the external threat in the form of this Kryptonian trio and the spectacle that lends itself to, as well as this internal struggle of Superman going after something he wants and ultimately having to give it up, I think that works. And those are the strengths of the movie for me. And it's one that is always fun to revisit. And like I said, this is now the third episode we've done on this podcast talking about it. So it certainly lends itself to conversation. So I thank you for joining me. I thank you to the audience for tuning in. As always, make sure you come back next week for Superman 3. And until then, as always, it's about what you do. It's about action. Be sure to check out our sister podcast series, Another Exciting Episode in the Adventures of Superman, an episode-by-episode breakdown of the classic George Reeves television show, available wherever you get podcasts. Please join us on social media, become a patron, and subscribe, rate, and review today. Links are in the show notes. Thank you all.